Imagine lace that could strangle you. It hangs from the canopy in delicate threads, stitched with flowers you cannot name, scented faintly with rosewater. The women who dressed you whispered that it was the softest fabric in the kingdom, spun by nuns with hands blessed by God. But as you sit at the edge of the bed, it feels like a net, fine enough to catch even a child. Your gown is too heavy for your frame. Gold threads pull at your shoulders, and the pearls sewn into your sleeves dig into your skin each time you shift. You can smell the starch in the linen, sharp and clean, nothing like the air of the courtyard where you used to play. Around you, the room glows with candlelight. Shadows dance along the stone walls. They make the space seem larger, emptier, as though the night is waiting to swallow you whole. They call it a wedding night. They call it holy. They call it the start of a life. And yet you sit here with your bare feet pressed into a carpet so thick it swallows your toes, knowing that nothing about this feels like life. Before we take you deeper into Isabella's story, I want you to remember something. These moments are not just in the past. Girls like her still exist in records no one reads, in countries no one visits, in families that keep their doors closed. If you believe their stories deserve to be told, subscribe now. Because silence is the greatest weapon history ever used, and we are here to break it. The door opens without a knock. Duke Alphonse steps inside, his figure framed by the hall's golden torchlight. He moves slowly, each step deliberate, his boots sinking into the rug. You've seen him before, across banquet tables, in processionals, but never this close, never without the buffer of a crowd. The jewelled chain across his chest gleams, his eyes do not. He smiles, but it's the kind of smile that has rules. His voice is low, smooth, the kind of voice people obey. He says your name like it belongs to him, like it is something he can tuck away in a drawer when he's finished. Behind him, the chamber door clicks shut. Your hands not in your lap. The lace sleeve bites into your palm. The women who dressed you are gone. The priest is gone. The music from the feast below is gone, muffled into nothing by the heavy stone walls. He tells you to stand. You do. He reaches out, brushing a strand of hair from your cheek. His fingers smell faintly of wine and iron. You don't flinch. You learned not to. He looks at you like a painting, something to be hung, admired, and owned. His gaze lingers on the pearls in your braid, the ones your mother's hands placed there hours ago. You wonder if she knew what they would mean tonight. He takes your hand, leads you toward the bed. The lace canopy sways as you pass beneath it, and for a moment it feels like the air has thickened, like you've stepped into water. The sheets are white, untouched, their edges embroidered with tiny suns. They smell of lavender. The pillows are puffed to perfection. You think about how many stitches it must have taken to make them so fine. You think about the women who sewed them and whether they were happy. The Duke sits on the edge and gestures for you to join him. The mattress dips under your weight, tilting you toward him. His knee touches yours. He says nothing more. The curtains begin to draw around you, slow and deliberate, until the world outside the bed is gone. The last thing you see before the lace meets is his shadow leaning closer. Silence became your second skin. It began with small corrections. A hand on your shoulder when you spoke too quickly. A glance across the table when your answer was longer than it should be. A tightening of his jaw when your laughter strayed from the script. You learned that words could be dangerous, that your voice could turn a room against you faster than any lie. So you kept it tucked away. In the private chambers, you moved like a shadow. You ate when he ate, stood when he stood. You learned to anticipate the weight of his moods by the sound of his footsteps in the corridor. If they were heavy, you stayed near the fire. If they were light, you kept your eyes lowered, ready for questions with only one correct answer. At banquets, you became a figure carved from glass, always seated slightly behind him, where your gown would catch the candlelight. You smiled when he spoke to you, just enough to show obedience, never enough to suggest joy. The courtiers adored you in the way people adore delicate things, for their fragility, not their strength. Before we go deeper into the walls that closed around Isabella, remember this: silence is not always the absence of words. It can be the cage that shapes a life. If you believe stories like hers deserve to be told in full, subscribe now. Because without witnesses, history repeats, and the cost is always the same. Your body grew, but your world did not. Days blurred into a rotation of rooms you could count on one hand. The chamber, the hall, the chapel, the balcony where you were allowed to stand for air under watchful eyes. The gowns became heavier, the jewellery more ornate, the smiles more practiced. The Duke praised you in public as the perfect young wife. He called you graceful, pious, a jewel in the house of Castrel. In private, his words were fewer, his silences longer. You came to understand that approval was never love, and that a gentle tone could hide the sharpest edge. Once, at a feast, he placed his hand on the back of your neck as he introduced you to a foreign ambassador. His thumb rested against your pulse, steady, claiming. You smiled at the man before you, felt the pearls in your hair sway against your cheek, and kept your eyes from showing what you felt. Even your reflection became untrustworthy. In the mirror, you saw a girl in silks, posture perfect, eyes unblinking. But behind the stillness, you could feel the slow erasure, each day rubbing away a little more of the girl who once knew how to run, to shout, to speak without fear. The court mistook your quiet for innocence. They didn't see the small ledger you kept in your mind. Who whispered to whom? Which servant carried which message? Whose eyes lingered too long on the Duke's chair when it was empty? You never wrote these things down. You didn't need to. Silence had given you a better memory than words ever could. At night, when the palace was still, you would lie in the vast bed under its lace canopy, tracing the patterns in the fabric with your eyes until you fell asleep. The designs never changed, but you memorized them anyway. It was something to own, and in the stillness you began to understand that the less you said, the more you saw. They began speaking of children before you had even learned the names of the women who dressed you. At first, it was only in passing, a toast to the future of the house, a smile from an old courtier when you passed in the corridor. But soon it became the measure by which you were valued. Every feast, every gathering, every whispered conversation in the chapel came back to the same question: when would you provide an heir? In the courts of Europe, lineage was currency. Marriages like yours were not built on affection. They were contracts sealed with skin and signed with blood. The Duke's line was ancient but thinning. His rivals had sons, grandsons, entire rows of heirs waiting to inherit. You were expected to restore the balance, not with words or deeds, but with your body. They spoke of it in front of you as if you were not there. The Duke and his advisors weighing alliances, discussing dowries, arranging godparents before you had even felt the weight of a child. The Queen Regent once remarked, smiling, that youthful brides often flower quickly. You smiled back because that was what was required. Before we take you deeper into the cost of such bargains, remember this. History remembers the heirs, not the women who nearly died giving them. If you believe those women deserve to be named, subscribe now. Because every dynasty was built on a ledger of lives that were never counted. By the time you were 12, your body had changed in ways you barely understood. The lace gowns that once hung loose now fit tightly across your chest. The murmurs in the great hall grew louder. The Duke's hand rested more heavily on your shoulder at banquets, his gaze more proprietary. When the first signs came, the missed days, the sickness in the morning, the chambermaids were told to keep silent. No one asked if you wanted this. It was assumed. You were a vessel, and vessels were meant to carry. The months blurred together. You were kept indoors, your meals arranged by the palace physician. At night, you lay awake, one hand on your stomach, trying to imagine the child they all wanted. Would it have your eyes, your silence? Would it even live to see the light? It did not. The bleeding began in the early hours of a winter morning. You were alone, the fire in your chamber long cold. Pain came in waves that left you gasping, clutching the bedpost until your knuckles burned white. The midwife arrived without ceremony, her face unreadable. She spoke to the servants, not to you. By dawn, it was over. A bundle too small to be swaddled was carried away. No prayers, no naming. The sheets, white once, were stripped from the bed and burned. The lace canopy swayed in the draught from the open door, the same as it had on your wedding night. The court did not speak of it. When you appeared at the next banquet, the Duke introduced you with the same polished words, and no one mentioned the hollowness in your gaze. The official record made no note of what happened that morning. In that silence you understood something new. Even your survival was not your own. It belonged to the house, to the alliances your name carried, to the bargains struck in rooms you would never enter. You smiled, because that was what was required, and you began to wonder how much more they could take before nothing remained at all. The court was a place where nothing went unseen. Every glance lingered longer than it should. Every whisper carried farther than the speaker intended. At 13, you began to feel their eyes on you not as a burden, but as a resource. If they insisted on watching, you would decide what they saw. It started small. A smile withheld from one lady, given instead to another. A glance across the hall that made two noblemen exchange uneasy looks. You discovered that your silence, once a shield, could also be a blade, and in the right light it could cut without drawing a single drop of red. The Duke's rivals studied you, searching for signs of weakness. They saw only stillness. His allies looked for warmth. You gave them only what they needed to keep their loyalty. A nod here, a hand resting lightly on a goblet there, gestures so subtle they seemed accidental until they weren't. Before we go further, remember this. In a world where women were expected to be silent, the rarest and most dangerous thing was a woman who controlled her silence. If you believe those women's stories should not be lost, subscribe now. Because their victories were often invisible, and invisibility was their weapon. You began to attend banquets not as the Duke's ornament, but as his mirror. When he smiled at someone, you made your expression unreadable. When he ignored a guest, you greeted them with a whisper and a touch to the hand. No one could accuse you of disloyalty, but slowly the balance shifted. People began to approach you first. Your laughter became currency. You spent it rarely, at moments calculated to draw attention. Once you allowed yourself a soft laugh at something said by the Queen Regent's advisor, knowing the Regent would notice and wonder what bond you shared. Another time, you let a smile bloom and vanish in the same heartbeat, leaving a foreign ambassador watching you for the rest of the evening, desperate to see it again. The servants became your most reliable messengers, not through direct orders. That would have been too obvious, but through the way you listened. You never interrupted, never reacted. You simply let their words settle, and when they left, you stored them carefully. A misplaced brooch in the Regent's apartments, a courier who arrived at night and departed before dawn, pieces of a puzzle you would assemble later. You learned to linger in doorways just long enough to be noticed but not questioned. You discovered how to pause before speaking so that the silence became its own form of pressure. The more they tried to read you, the more they revealed themselves. In the privacy of your chambers, you practiced stillness before a mirror, how to widen your eyes in feigned surprise, how to tilt your head in a way that made others believe you were listening more closely than you were, every expression rehearsed until it felt effortless. The Duke did not see the change. To him, you remained the obedient child bride, but in the spaces between his notice you were becoming something else, a presence the court could not easily define, a figure that moved within their gaze yet never entirely within their grasp. You were learning that power was not always in the hand that struck first. Sometimes it was in the eyes that made others hesitate to move at all. Fear had a sound. You first noticed it in the hitch of a servant's breath when you entered a room unannounced, in the way Lady Katerina's hands trembled as she poured wine into your goblet, careful not to spill a single drop. It was different from the fear you had known, the kind that hollowed your chest and froze your tongue. This fear belonged to them, and it felt useful. The Duke's cruelty had sharpened with time. His words, once laced with politeness, now came with an edge meant to draw blood without breaking skin. He would correct you in front of guests, dismiss you mid-sentence, let his gaze wander toward other women as if you weren't worth the attention. In the beginning, it burned, but now you felt something colder, steadier, calculation. One evening, during a supper meant only for the two of you, he pushed away his plate and accused you of forgetting your place. The silence stretched, heavy, waiting for you to retreat. You didn't. Instead, you set down your knife slowly, letting the metal tap against the plate. You met his eyes without a word. The corners of his mouth twitched, not in amusement, but in something closer to uncertainty. Before we go further, remember this. Sometimes the most dangerous thing a woman can do is refuse to be afraid. If you believe history's most feared women deserve to be remembered for more than their reputations, subscribe now. Because behind every story of cruelty, there is another, of someone who learned to wield it. From that night, you began to test the edges. You stopped rushing to answer when he called. You let silences grow until they became uncomfortable. You spoke to his advisors in the same even tone you used with him, forcing them to wonder whether you knew something they didn't. The servants were the easiest to sway. You never raised your voice, never struck them. Instead, you let your displeasure show in subtler ways. A glance at a poorly folded gown, a pause before taking the cup they offered. Soon, they began anticipating your moods, correcting mistakes before you could notice them. Their nervous obedience became a kind of armour. Lady Katerina, once your quiet ally, began to shrink from your presence. You saw her flinch when your eyes lingered on her too long. It wasn't hatred you felt for her. It was recognition. You had been her once, terrified of saying the wrong thing, terrified of being seen. Now you knew the power in being the one who did the seeing. Rumour started to spread, that you could remember the smallest detail of any conversation, that you knew when someone had lied before they spoke, that the Duke himself thought twice before crossing you in private. You didn't deny any of it. You began to choose your appearances carefully, arriving late to gatherings so that all eyes turned to you at once, wearing a single jewel, one the Duke had given you years before, so that people wondered what message you meant to send. You let them wonder. The Duke tried to reassert his dominance with sharper words, harsher commands, but you had learned something vital. Fear could be redirected. If you carried yourself as though nothing could touch you, people began to believe it. And once they believed it, they behaved as though it were true. You were no longer the girl who learned to be silent. You were the woman who could fill a room without saying a word, and leave it colder when you were gone. The Queen Regent's fall did not begin with a shout. It began with a whisper. One night, over a goblet of spiced wine, you let a single sentence slip into the air. Light, careless, as though it had escaped you by accident. A remark about a letter, a name that should not have been in it. You did not linger on the thought. You let it float, trusting it would find the ears it needed. In the days that followed, the court stirred like a hive. Servants exchanged glances in the corridors. Courtiers leaned closer during dances, their smiles too sharp. You kept your own expression perfectly still. That was the key, to look as though you knew nothing, while knowing exactly how much you had set in motion. Marguerite had ruled the regency with a careful hand, but she had also made enemies. She had silenced some, ignored others, and taken what she wanted without asking. All you had to do was give those resentments a voice, and make sure no one could trace it back to you. Before we go further, remember this. History often paints powerful women as victims of betrayal, but sometimes they are the ones holding the brush. If you want to hear the stories of those who survived by creating their own legends, subscribe now. Because power is never given, it's taken. The forged letters came next. A servant loyal to you delivered them into the right hands. Papers that hinted at deals with foreign powers, signed in Marguerite's hand but never truly hers. They were perfect imitations, down to the flourish of the final letter, crafted by a scribe who owed you more than his freedom. At a feast, you let your gaze rest on Marguerite for just a moment too long. She noticed. Everyone did. By the next morning, whispers about her loyalty had grown into accusations. No one would say who started them. They didn't have to. Marguerite tried to confront you once, in a hallway lined with portraits. She spoke your name, her voice tight with fury, demanding to know what you had done. You simply smiled, the kind of smile that refused to confirm or deny. Behind you, the painted faces of queens past seemed to lean in, listening. By the time the Duke moved against her, the court had already turned away. Friends avoided her gaze, servants found reasons to be elsewhere, and those who once sought her favour now sought yours. When the exile decree was read, it was met with silence, the deepest cruelty the court could offer. She left the palace without ceremony, escorted by guards who kept their eyes forward. You watched from an upper window, your hands resting lightly on the stone sill. You didn't wave, you did not speak. That night, the Duke raised his goblet to you in the great hall. His words were full of praise for your grace, your loyalty, your unwavering presence at his side. You knew the truth. The goblet was not for you. It was for the court to remind them who had delivered him this victory. And yet, when you sat beside him beneath the gilded canopy, you felt the weight of every gaze fixed on you, not with pity, not with doubt, with something colder, sharper, fear. The next morning the heralds announced your new title, not Queen Regent, not Consort, but sovereign in your own right when the Duke was away. The most feared woman in court, and the only one who knew just how easily fear could be taught. The throne was not built for comfort. Its arms were carved in the shape of snarling lions, their teeth bared, their wooden jaws fixed forever in threat. The back rose high above your head, heavy with gold leaf that caught the morning light. You sat perfectly still, the lace from your wedding night draped across your shoulders. Once, it had been the shroud of a child bride. Now, it was armour. The Duke was away, chasing a border dispute that would keep him gone for weeks. The hall was yours. Courtiers entered one by one, bowing low, each forced to meet your gaze before they spoke. Some stumbled over their words. Others kept their voices steady but could not keep their hands from tightening at their sides. You listened to them all. Merchants seeking trade routes, nobles pleading for favour, priests delivering carefully chosen scripture. You gave each the same measured nod, the same calm that let them wonder what you were thinking. You had learned that silence could speak louder than any decree. Before we take you to the end of Isabella's story, remember this. Some women are remembered for their crowns, others for their chains, but the most dangerous are remembered for the way they made people look away. If you believe history's forgotten queens deserve to stand in the light again, subscribe now, because their power was rarely given. It was taken piece by piece until it belonged entirely to them. The lace brushed against your wrists as you shifted, its edges catching on the carved lions. You let it linger there, a reminder to the court of where you had begun and what you had become. You knew they remembered. The whispers in the corners, the averted eyes, the way even the Duke's most loyal allies paused before addressing you. All of it told you they had not forgotten the girl in the bed with the closed curtains. But that girl was gone. You spent the day in measured rulings. A minor noble who had defied the Duke found his land grant delayed with no explanation. A merchant who once mocked your youth was awarded a contract that forced him into your debt. Every choice you made was deliberate, each ripple sent through the court as carefully as the first whisper that had destroyed the Queen Regent. When the last petitioner left, you rose from the throne and walked the length of the empty hall. Your footsteps echoed against the marble, steady, unhurried. The sunlight caught in the lace, turning it almost white again, as if it were new. But you felt the weight of every night it had touched your skin, every memory it carried like stitches hidden in the hem. In your chambers you stood before the mirror. Not the mirror of your childhood, where a girl had practiced smiling on command, but the mirror of a sovereign. You saw the tilt of your head, the sharpness in your eyes, the way the lace framed your face not as decoration but as declaration. You thought of the first time the Duke had looked at you and seen only something to own, and you imagined what he would see now, a figure who could unmake him with the same quiet precision she had used on his rivals. Outside, the bells rang to mark the hour. You turned toward the window, where the courtyard below was empty, the winter light casting long shadows across the stones. Somewhere beyond those walls, the Duke was still the master of his domain. But here, in the heart of the palace, every breath, every step, every glance belonged to you. You turned back to the mirror, and then you looked beyond it, past the glass, past the room, past the walls, to where you imagined the watchers would be, your gaze held steady, as if daring them to forget you.